These unmanned remote-controlled vehicles were the prime example of the German ingenuity during World War II. On the other hand, they are also perfect examples how to spend valuable development time and resources on an over-engineered weapon that only have questionable combat value. But actually their story started when during the occupation of France, the German soldiers managed to salvage some interesting French prototypes from the Seine River. These were the Sd.Kfz 302 and 303 tracked mine carriers, the so-called Goliath family. So let's see the history of these vehicles today. The remote-controlled weapons and demolition vehicles were not new by the time World War II broke out. There were several experimental vehicles developed during the First World War for the sole purpose of crossing the no man's land and deliver explosives to the trenches of the opposing forces. A good example for these interesting weapons was the Schneider crocodile land torpedo developed during the Great War. It was not very effective, but it paved the way for similar designs. Another example is the Aubry-Ogabe electric torpedo, which appeared in 1915. An American design, the Wickersham land torpedo, the work of Elmer Wickersham, was patented at the end of the First World War, and based on his design, the British also developed a similar weapon, the Vickers Beetle. A French vehicle also emerged later in the 1930s, developed by Adolphe Caigres, and this was the design that influenced the Germans to develop their own remote-controlled vehicles, though as it turned out, they didn't want to start from scratch. In Germany, interest in remote-controlled weapons increased during the interwar period, as they were a safe option to attack fortified positions. But the Treaty of Versailles restricted the German military development. The German military intelligence, however, amongst other developments, kept an eye on the evolution of the Caigres design. By 1940, when the Battle of France began, this vehicle was in the prototype phase, and the Germans were well aware of its evolution, and very much wanted to capture these vehicles. To prevent their work falling into enemy hands, the designers, when the German forces approached Paris, sunk the finished models in the Seine. But the Germans managed to recover some of them, and soon they got their hands on the original blueprints as well. These eventually ended up at the Borgward Automotive Company in Bremen, together with instructions from the German Ordnance Office to reverse engineer them and come up with a similar design. The company, after about a year of development, presented their own vehicle, which both in size and looks very much resembled the original Caigres design. After the initial trials, it was standardized as Sd.Kfz 302 light charge carrier. This was a small tracked vehicle, just about 150 by 85 cm in size, and was powered by a pair of 2.5 horsepower electric motors. The vehicle's body was divided into 3 compartments. The front housed a 60 kg explosive charge. The center section contained the batteries and motors, while the rear was the compartment for the control wire. On the front of the vehicle, 5mm thick armor plating was used to protect it from enemy fire, but the sides and the tracks were unprotected, as the designers had to keep the vehicle as light as possible, given the limited power of the electric motors. With the electric drive, the vehicle was very quiet, but it only had a top speed of 6 km an hour. And though in theory the batteries provided about 1.5 km range, in reality its combat radius was much shorter. The recharging of the batteries at the front line was also problematic, and the electric components were very expensive to manufacture. Each vehicle cost about 3,000 Reichsmarks, which equals about $15,000 today, a very high price for a one-use suicide machine. Still, about 2,600 units were built, but it was clear an improved version was needed. So very soon, a second iteration of the Goliath appeared. This was the Sd.Kfz 303 model, which was developed to overcome the limitations of its predecessor. This variant was somewhat bigger than the 302 model, and instead of the expensive electric motors, it used a cheap and simple 700cc two-stroke petrol engine. Though this made it louder than the electric drive, but under combat conditions, this was not a real problem, as the noise of the battlefield lightly suppressed it anyway. Meanwhile, the stronger petrol engine allowed the vehicle to carry a larger 75 kg explosive charge, doubled its speed to 12 km an hour, and extended its range to about 10 km. The Sd.Kfz 303 was later once again updated, and the B variant featured a slightly larger 800cc engine and could carry a 100 kg explosive charge. These petrol-powered variants are easy to recognize from their intakes on the top. The A models featured a smaller one, while the later B models had a larger, more prominent air inlet. But of course the main feature of the vehicle was the remote control system. The Goliaths carried 650 meters of wire, which was connected to the control box used by the operator. 2 of the 3 wires were used to control the vehicle, while the third one was connected to the explosives, so the operator could choose the optimal time to detonate the vehicle. The simple and ingenious cable control allowed the operator to stay at a safe distance from the explosion, in theory making this vehicle ideal to be used against bunkers or machine gun nests. But the cable control also made the vehicle vulnerable. Artillery shells, obstacles, or even small arms fire could sever the cable, resulting in the vehicle being stuck out in the open with a fairly big explosive charge in it. Of course, given the time period, these vehicles could not carry cameras, so the operators always had to have a line of sight on the vehicle. The Goliaths were also vulnerable to enemy fire, as though their front was armored, the tracks and sides were unprotected, and even the front could be penetrated by a heavy machine gun or any large caliber weapon. The first electric-powered variant of these vehicles, the Sd.Kfz 302, was 150 cm long, 85 cm wide, and 56 cm tall, and weighted around 370 kg. It was powered by a pair of 2.5 horsepower electric motors, and carried a 60 kg explosive charge. This model was in production from early 1942 until January 1944, and about 2,600 units were built. The later Sd.Kfz 303 was somewhat bigger, 169 cm long, 91 cm wide, and 62 cm tall, and it weighted 430 kg. This variant used a 2-cylinder 700cc and later an 800cc petrol engine, developing around 12 horsepower, and they could carry a 75 and later a 100 kg explosive charge. This variant entered production in April 1943, and about 4,900 units were built. The Goliath was first deployed in 1942, initially on the Eastern Front, and later in Italy and France, and more than 7,500 units were built from these vehicles before the end of World War II. They participated in most big engagements, were used at the Battle of Kursk, at Anzio, the Normandy landings, southern France, and some even took part in the German answer to the Warsaw Uprising as well. Despite the widespread belief, these remote-controlled vehicles were not actually used against tanks, as they were too slow to be effective in that role. Their main use was to clear minefields and attack bunkers and other stationary targets. They were not something that can be considered successful, however, as for a remote-controlled vehicle, they were too big, too slow, and vulnerable, so many of them never reached their targets. Their use had more of a psychological impact on the other side. Many of these vehicles were captured by the Allies. Either if they malfunctioned, their cables were severed, or sometimes they were just found in storage as the Allies advanced. Despite their complicated use and design, the Germans developed even bigger remote-controlled vehicles, like the Sd.Kfz 301 heavy charge carrier and the Sd.Kfz 304 medium charge carrier, which were about the size of small tankettes and more than twice the size of the Goliath. These vehicles in the end are prime examples of German over-engineering, when a relatively complicated and expensive weapon was used as a suicide bomb carrier, taking up development time and resources from other more useful designs. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.